I am Mandy Kern, and I am the Program Specialist at the Kansas Wetlands Education Center near Cheyenne Bottoms. This video will be a discussion over evolution and natural selection. One of the best ways to showcase natural selection is through bird beaks, and if Cheyenne Bottoms is known for anything, it is for the amount and diversity of birds that pass through our wetlands. We'll talk about some theories behind natural selection, look at the bills and beaks of birds common to Cheyenne Bottoms, and then you'll meet our resident American Kestrel. Please get out a piece of paper you can use for answering questions and taking notes. The first two questions are, what is the difference between divergent evolution and convergent evolution? First, I want to introduce you to Cheyenne Bottoms. It is a 41,000 acre wetland complex, the largest marsh in the interior of the United States. How cool is it that it is right here in Kansas? Before you watch the video, write down 2 things you already know about Cheyenne Bottoms, and then at the end of the video, 2 things that surprised you.
You wouldn't expect it from a sea of grass. No, not to harbor an ocean of water. It's a paradox. More than 60 square miles of perpetual wetlands in America's heartland prairie. But it's a place well known to winged travelers who course the ancient skyways between summer and winter homes. It's a great oasis that calls them down to feed and rest. And it's a treasure of Kansas. Cheyenne Bottoms, famed through history as a wondrous resource, wildlife haven, and hunting ground, is first and foremost a natural harbor for interior migrants. And it's not just ducks and geese. Thousands of shorebirds use Cheyenne Bottoms as a staging area during spring and fall migrations. At least 350 of the 475 bird species reported in Kansas have been seen in this premier 41,000 acre natural land sink. Perching birds, wading birds, seabirds, aerialists, waterfowl, raptors. All these and others offer spectacular viewing opportunities during seasonal flights. Cheyenne Bottoms is the largest wetland complex in the interior United States and holds designations as a Wetlands of International Importance, a Western Hemispheric Shorebird Reserve Site, and a globally important bird area by various bird conservation groups. And birders from across the continent and world visit to witness its annual bird movements across the Central Flyway.
point of doing science isn't really to discover what happened in history, but to use observations to predict what is happening right now in the world and what will happen in the future. Biologists do this by studying organisms and how they live and interact. A good example of the power of scientific observations is to look at the biodiversity of islands. So you can see here the Canary Islands are 62 miles west of Morocco. Can you answer these questions about the organisms that live here? So which island would have the most unique species found nowhere else? Answer that on your paper. Which would have fossils most similar to a sample found in Morocco from the same time period? And if a lizard fossil was found on the middle island, would one of the west be younger or older? Because of nearly 200 years of scientific observations, biologists know a few things about what to expect on an island. So 1, smaller islands and islands farther away from the mainland are more likely to have more unique species that aren't found anywhere else. Think about Australia's weird animals. Once a few organisms land on a small or distant island, they are more likely to stay isolated through many generations of genetic changes that are different from islands that have frequent visitors from the mainland. 2, islands close to the mainland would have more fossils of the same age at the same time because organisms are more likely to have made it from one place to the other. And 3, fossils of a species found farther from the mainland are likely younger than ones found closer. It took longer, maybe millions of years, for that species to make its way as far, then die and be fossilized. By that time, it may have disappeared from the eastern islands. The predictions we just made have actually been confirmed in many cases on the Canary Islands. Here are a few things. So if you look at the top, A, it's hard to read the names, but there are lizard species that are found all over. But the ones on the western islands are more likely to be found only there. On B, for a few types of lizards, we can see how fossil records show their movement over millions of years across the islands. And then C, even if a lizard does happen to show up first on a western island, the fossils show their paths over time as they island hop farther and farther away. So it's not too hard to understand the idea of animals traveling from one island to another. But if we look at what is happening genetically, there are 2 ways that islands are a perfect place to develop unique adaptations. These examples are called genetic drift, because the gene pool of a population can suddenly drift towards one trait or another. The founder effect shows how a tiny population or portion of the population could move somewhere new, and the mix of genes that they take with them could be very different than the overall population average. Maybe only the longer-winged birds from a flock were blown off course to a distant island, and now this group has no short-winged genes. The bottleneck effect is when an event suddenly shrinks the population to a small number, and some of the genes don't make it. This could be due to something like a drought, where only a certain trait allows organisms to survive, or something a bit more random, like a volcanic eruption that wipes out most of the plant life in an area, but leaves a small portion. In the 1830s, Charles Darwin took a voyage around the world that ended up changing how biologists understand biodiversity and what this means about the Earth's history and future. Darwin didn't invent the idea of evolution, where modern species were developed from past ancestors. There were many theories of how this might happen. But Darwin's close observations of how animals and plants interacted, especially on islands, led him to develop a mechanism of evolution that stood up to scientific scrutiny and successfully predicted things that ended up being confirmed as a scientific method and technology improved over the past 190 years. And this was before anyone even knew about genetics, which ended up explaining even more about why Darwin's predictions were correct. Darwin's mechanism of evolution was called natural selection, which meant that nature's dangers would select which traits end up surviving over time. Because of what we already know about islands and biodiversity, we can see how the Galapagos Islands would have been a great place for Darwin to study isolated animal populations and see how they have been changing over time. In this picture of the Galapagos Islands, which is the most isolated island? So answer that on your paper. And then answer, what would that mean about the species we could expect to find there compared to some of the other islands? When we think of natural selection, the phrase survival of the fittest likely comes to mind. But this doesn't mean Darwin thought that only the strongest animals would or should survive. Being fit doesn't mean strong. Darwin saw four things over and over as he observed life all around the island. The first was overproduction. Each generation produces more offspring than what can survive on the available resources. Some will die, some will live and reproduce, and then they will reproduce, and they will reproduce. Natural selection is also variation. Organisms have differences. Some are helpful for survival, some are not. The same trait can be helpful or harmful in different conditions. We now know that some variations are the result of small genetic recombinations or mutations. Natural selection is also heritability, the variations that will be passed down to offspring by the individuals who survive and are able to reproduce. And then it's also reproductive advantage. Good traits that help a generation survive will be passed down and will show up more frequently in the next generation, gradually changing the genetic makeup of the population as conditions change and as different traits are a better fit for that environment. So survival of the fittest is talking about the organism that is the most reproductively fit for the conditions. Which one can produce more offspring that survive to reproduce on down the line? If this happens over enough generations, the species that develop will have different traits than the original species. Now that we understand genetics and ecological events like genetic drift, we can see how the simple principles of natural selection would work. One of Darwin's most famous conclusions was based on his observations of the beaks of finches found on the islands. It's actually thought that these finches are more closely related to tanagers, but in some areas he found short beaks, some long, some pointy, some more parrot-like, each of these ate different things and had different behaviors. But Darwin could see how these traits would develop if a group of finches had landed on one island and spread out to others over huge periods of time. At each new island, conditions were slightly different, so slightly different traits gave a slight reproductive advantage. Over many generations, the less fit traits had disappeared from that population. We now know that beak size in finches is controlled by one gene, and that events like drought tend to give an advantage to shorter beaks rather than larger beaks. If two competing bird populations live in the same area and compete for the same food, both of their survival rates would fall, but the variation of a population would include some slightly bigger or smaller beaks. As the slightly bigger and slightly smaller beaked birds eat slightly bigger and slightly smaller food, they compete against each other less, meaning that their offspring would survive. Through many generations, the two populations diverge from each other, with one developing smaller and smaller beaks, and the other getting bigger. Because of these changes, they make them both more fit. We're going to meet an example of convergent evolution at the end of the video. But populations can also converge as they evolve. This is when similar traits develop, likely because the same physical change can fix a shared natural stressor. In the American Kestrel and the cheetah and many other animals, a black streak under the eyes leads to less glare in the sunshine. All right, we are going to meet a series of birds, and on your paper, I want you to write the name of each bird and then pause when I show the bird and write a hypothesis as to what you think the bird eats based on its bill. So we're going to start this first bird, very important to Cheyenne Bottoms and the Kansas Wetlands Education Center. It's actually the bird on our logo. This is kind of our mascot bird. And so if you look at its bill, it's very long, up curved. Pause the video and tell me what you think this bill is used for. So this is a shorebird, and I'll talk about a lot of shorebirds today, which means that often they'll migrate from shore to shore and travel long distances. Some of these birds, thousands and thousands of miles to get to their nesting grounds. But again, Cheyenne Bottoms is a very important spot for a lot of these shorebirds, and we'll have several thousand shorebirds pass through each spring and fall. The American avocet will actually stay, some will nest here, breed here, and spend their summers here. But this long up curved bill is good for what they do is they'll sweep it from side to side, scooping up different prey, usually insects, maybe small crustaceans in the water. A favorite food, we've got a midge fly. This is the adult, and its larva we call bloodworms. And in the month of June, we have a statistic saying we can find 64,000 bloodworms in a square meter, so a 3 by 3 foot box. We can find 64,000 bloodworms. And so all those shorebirds that pass through here, it's a very important food source for them. So we'll often see large swarms of the adults, and then after they mate and lay their eggs, they'll die, usually in large piles and swarms. And then the shorebirds will feed off of those that larva in the water. And so they may put just the little upturned part of their bill in the shallow part of the water. They may use it to kind of probe and pull some things out, but they're often seen kind of going back and forth, kind of scraping that bill over the water. All right, our Kansas state bird, the western meadowlark. Pause the video and record what you think this bill would be used to feed with. So in Kansas, we have both an eastern and a western meadowlark. They're both very identical in appearance, and they've got the V-shaped black mark on their neck, yellow chest, and the only way to tell them apart is by their call. The western meadowlark, people like to say it's saying, "Kansas is beautiful," whereas the eastern meadowlark has a shorter kind of 2-whistle call that says, "Spring is here." But both meadowlark species, and so this one's our western meadowlark, they'll walk through the grass, kind of stirring up insects, and so they can use their bill to maybe pull some insects, spiders, maybe some worms out of the ground and kind of probe and pull those, but they'll also eat grains and seeds that they find on the ground. A favorite that we have here at Cheyenne Bottoms is called the Wilson's phalarope. So pause and tell me what you think that needle-like bill is used for. So a shorebird, the Wilson's phalarope, will travel in large flocks, and so they'll arrive with lots of their friends, and what they'll do is they'll actually spin around in these tight little circles, making these little cyclones or vortex. And what that will do is that will kind of suck things up off of the bottom of the bottoms or their water source and pull up insects to the top of the water, and then they can just kind of gently peck those insects off of the surface of the water. And so lots of teamwork working together. One of the insects that they might be feeding off of, this is an adult mayfly. And their larvae, or their babies, look like this. These feather-like frilly things, these are their gills on their abdomen, so that's how they breathe and how a lot of our aquatic insects breathe. But those little frilly gills are really pretty to see when we capture them. Our mayflies are also really important bioindicators, meaning we can use life to indicate the quality of a water source. So if we find a mayfly, sometimes that's a good indicator that our water is clean because they don't tolerate polluted water and lay their eggs. The adults will lay their eggs in a nice clean water source. So we like to find those mayfly and mayfly larvae here at Cheyenne Bottoms. Let's move to another grassland bird. This is a lesser prairie chicken. So take a look at that bill and let me know what you think that bill would be used for. Here at Cheyenne Bottoms, we have the greater prairie chicken in our area, and one of our favorite things to do in the spring is we actually offer lek tours. A lek is their breeding ground, and where the males will go and they'll do this booming, making the sound with they'll puff up their cheek pouches and make a booming sound, and they'll dance and strut on that lek, and they're trying to attract a female. And the female will pick the male that has the best dance. Other males might fight with each other, and it's a really impressive sight to see. It's something that if you get the chance someday, go out and find those. But these birds will spend their days walking through the grasslands. But if you'll notice the bill, how it's a little bit different than that meadowlark, which is going to have a very similar habitat in grassland. And when we do our lek tours, there are meadowlarks all around also. And so these prairie chickens, they're going to feed on grains and insects, small insects like the meadowlark would also, but they're more curved. Sharp bill might be better for crushing nuts, acorns. They actually will also eat maybe twigs, flowers, leaves from a tree. So they're a very omnivorous bird, eating both meat sources like those insects, but also different plant sources as well. Moving back to the water, I have what's called a northern shoveler. And I want to get that bill up really close there to the camera. Pause and record what you think northern shovelers or duck-like birds eat. So if you'll notice, this bird has a lot. You can see that those hairs kind of hanging from the bill. It's called a northern shoveler because its bill is very large, shovel-like. But what a duck will eat, and this kind of duck is actually, it's called a dabbling duck, meaning when they feed, they'll put their heads in the water and they'll stick their tails up, maybe out of the water, but they do not dive. A diving duck would go down to the bottom of the water source. And so a dabbling duck, they just kind of feed from the surface of the water. And what ducks will do is they'll scoop up that water, and then they're a filter. These little hairs kind of work as like a sieve, and so the water will drain out from around their bills, but then if they're feeding on vegetation generally, and so things like grasses, sedges, pond weeds, and they'll take it and the water will come out and they'll grind their bills together and kind of do that. They might also pick up some insects, maybe some small crustaceans in the water when they do that as well, but this bill is generally used as a filter or a sieve. I am sure that you're familiar with woodpeckers. This one is what we call a red-headed woodpecker. So pause and record what you think their bill is used for. So our woodpeckers often store and cache food, especially in the winter. And so they're storing maybe nuts, different acorns, hiding them in holes and crevices in trees. Red-headed woodpeckers are more omnivorous than other kinds of woodpeckers. They have a wide variety and range of food, and they'll eat insects, they'll eat worms, grasshoppers, but they'll also eat berries, nuts, like we talked about. They may also eat bark, occasionally eggs from other birds that they find in nests. But what's really unique about a woodpecker, since they're pecking and tapping at that wood, they have a tongue that actually protects their brain. So their tongue actually wraps around the back of their head and cushions their brain as they thump and peck at the wood to hide and cache their food. This bird is a favorite of mine. This is a common nighthawk. They've got a teeny tiny bill, very large head. So pause and write down what you think this bill would be used for. So a common nighthawk, and our nighthawks are crepuscular, meaning they come out at dusk and dawn. They'll feed during the day and they'll feed at night, especially around lighted areas, so light posts. What they're doing is they're swooping and flying and catching flying insects. And so even though this bill looks teeny, teeny, tiny, they can open their mouth, gaping wide mouth, and they swoop and they catch those flying insects. But what's really neat about these birds is they also have kind of a booming mating ritual that you can hear through their wings. The males can flex their wings when they fly, and especially when they're swooping and diving, flex their wings and air will rush through their primary feathers and it'll make a sound. And so they've got a peet, peet call that's very distinguishable and you can hear when you're outside, especially at night in the summer. And then you can hear that sound rushing through their wings. But these guys are going to eat flying insects like grasshoppers, moths, but also swarms of mosquitoes. So these are good guys. You want them in your backyard. So look for common nighthawks. This bird is called a long-billed curlew. So we started with that American avocet, which had that very long curved up bill. This one is curved down. So take a minute, record what you think this bird might eat. This is one of our larger shorebirds, long-billed curlew, and they've got that very long, curved down bill. You'll see these birds walking very quickly on mudflats, and they're using that bill to probe. And they can actually use that to get down into burrows, maybe like a crayfish chimney, and put their bill in there, but then they'll also probe on the mudflats, pulling out different insects. They're gonna eat larger prey. So when you think about, we've got a lot of adult mosquitoes, not mosquitoes, adult dragonflies in our area. Their larvae, we call them naiads. So this is a dragonfly naiad, and they live in the water and they're aquatic, and so they might pick those out. Long-billed curlew might also eat a frog, maybe a small rodent, but they're also known for eating eggs of other birds and maybe nestlings of other birds as well. Here's our great horned owl, and other owl species are known as nocturnal birds of prey. Take a minute. What do you think that bill is used for eating? We've got that very sharp, curved bill. And if you could see the talons on those birds, I'm sure you know that they are known for catching prey, eating rodents. Great horned owls especially are very aggressive hunters. They may eat larger things. They'll eat mice and rats, but if they can catch a rabbit, maybe a skunk, possum, they'll eat what they can get. Owls are very silent flyers. You can see these large eye cavities. Their eyes are very good at bringing in lots of light, especially in the dark. So they're very good night hunters, and they can capture that prey, and they'll eat them and swallow them in large chunks. And an activity we like to do here at the Kansas Wetlands Education Center is kind of be a crime scene investigator. And we'll dissect these owl pellets. And so what they'll do is when they eat their food, they can't digest the fur, the hair, bones, feathers, or scales if they were to eat a fish. And so every so often they need to regurgitate and basically vomit up the parts that they can't digest. And we can break those apart and we can figure out what they ate. And we often use barn owl pellets because barn owls live in barns or other structures, and so their pellets are easy to find because they've got kind of that home where they're spitting them out in kind of the same spot each time. And so we will find moles and voles and different kinds of mice, and so it's really fun to kind of put those bones together, articulate their skeleton, and make that creature and figure out and identify what it was. The bird we're going to end on is called a sandhill crane. Let's take a look at that really large bill. This is one of our larger birds that will migrate through Cheyenne Bottoms. What do you think that bill is used for eating? It's a very large bird. Sandhill cranes, very good numbers. I love hearing them fly over. They've got a very distinctive cackling call that we can identify when they fly over in large flocks. But the sandhill crane has a relative called the whooping crane. It's very rare, it's endangered. But Cheyenne Bottoms and to the south of us just a little bit, Quivira National Wildlife Refuge, they're a very important habitat for these birds and these cranes. But a sandhill crane, they're omnivores. They'll eat insects, roots of insects, or roots of aquatic plants. Might eat a frog or a lizard, maybe a small rodent, nestling birds and other from other species. But often we'll see them in the bottoms, maybe resting overnight. And so the best time to see them is early morning or kind of at dusk when they fly back in, they'll spend their day feeding in pastures, maybe eating grain and different seeds that are on the ground. And then they'll come to the bottoms to rest, and then in the morning they'll have built up their energy sources so that they can continue on that migration and fly until they reach their nesting grounds up in Canada and in the Arctic Circle. All right, I want you to meet Pippin, or Pip. Pip is an American Kestrel. And she came to this center, you can kind of see, she had an injured wing, and by the time she was found, it was unable to be healed and repaired, and so she would be unable to kind of survive and live in the wild. And so a lot of the animals we have here, we're not a rehab center, but they came from rehab centers. But before we go any further, a couple of words, vocabulary words I want you to look up before we talk about the American Kestrel a little bit more. I want you to look up the meaning or the definition of sexual dimorphism, ocellus, a tomial tooth, and a malar stripe. I'll tell you a little bit more about Pip, the American Kestrel. All right, so Pippin is a falcon and one of the smallest falcons, or the smallest falcon in North America. But even though she's very small, or he's very small, they pack a lot of fierce predatorness in a small body. They prefer to live they favor open areas with short vegetation and very few trees. And also give a prediction as to what you think Pip might eat. So you can see I'm wearing a glove. So sharp talons, very sharp bill. So you can assume she is a bird of prey. But as a smaller falcon, what do you think she eats? He eats. Since they like to live in wide open areas, they often are found kind of perching on fence posts or lines, wire lines, electricity lines, and looking for their prey. And what they'll do is they'll pounce or dive towards their prey. They will sometimes hover, and when they hover, they face the wind, and they use their long tails to adjust and stay in place. I asked you to look up what sexual dimorphism is. And what that means is both the male and female of the species will have variations, differences. And so on your own, I want you to look up what some of those differences are. What are the visual characteristics that make a female kestrel look different from a male kestrel? But one of those marks that both male and female have, see if I can show them, that ocellus that you looked up, you can kind of see on the back of his head, you can see two dark black circles. What an ocellus is a false eye. And so that really helps them avoid predation, makes it look like they have an eye or eyes in the back of their head. And because it is a small falcon, they could be susceptible to being eaten by other larger birds of prey. Hawks, larger falcons might eat them. And so having that ocellus really helps them stand out. So what did you write down that you think kestrels or Pip might eat? And so they eat mostly smaller prey, insects. Insects might include grasshoppers, cicadas, beetles. They might eat frogs, snakes. They might also eat small rodents. We do feed Pip 2 small mice each day here at the center. But I asked you what a tomial tooth is. And I don't know if she'll get close enough to the camera, but what it is on her bill, she actually has a kind of indention in that beak that would allow very sharp. And so if she can actually, I can feel her bite through the glove sometimes, and so it's a very sharp bite. And what it does is when she captures his prey, it will sever the vertebrae of that prey, and so kind of kill them kill them instantly. Now, falcons and kestrels like Pip can see ultraviolet light, which allows them to see urine trails from rodents, and they can see where the rodents might be hiding or where they've traveled to. They are day hunters, and so that's just one other way to help them catch their food. They can hide surplus kills in maybe grass clumps or around fence posts or even tree cavities, and just another method to kind of save that food for later if they would need to, or hunting might be scarce. The last vocabulary word was that malar stripe. You can see he has two bands on both sides of his face down from his eye. And so that malar stripe helps. It's very similar to how a football player might put black lines under their eyes. And so it really helps with that sun glare and keeps, especially because they're a day hunter and they're flying and hovering in wide open areas, keep the sun out of their face, and black will absorb light. And so it won't bounce off and reflect in their eyes. And so they're able to really find that prey a little bit better. But that malar stripe is our example of a convergent evolution trait. So I asked you to look up what convergent evolution was earlier. And you know that that is a type of evolution that occurs in species that are not similar. So, malar striping could be in other animals like mammals. And so I want you to write down 3 examples of other animals that have a malar stripe.